Good morning. I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche Organization Daily Update for Tuesday, July 15th. Now, those of you that tuned in yesterday for an update may have noticed that it was missing, in part related to the historic conference in Berlin that the Schiller Institute put on, Man is Not a Wolf to Man, which I encourage all of you to go and watch the proceedings of that conference. I will touch on a certain part of that, and of course on the other strategic matters that we see in light of the aftermath of the meeting that Donald Trump and Mark Rutte, the Director General of NATO, had yesterday, where certain announcements or non-announcements may have been made. But I think it's important that that all these various actors in NATO, the NATO structure, are really participants in a kind of tragedy that is unfolding, certainly a dangerous tragedy. And I think this gets to the point of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche had done in her keynote speech at the Berlin conference over the weekend, where she identified Friedrich Schiller, of course, the playwright or poet and playwright that the Schiller Institute is named after. But Helga Zepp-LaRouche identified Schiller's idea of the punctum saliens that you see within his dramatic works, but really are an indication or part of the unfolding of human history, that you do come to those certain moments in history where decisions are made that can determine the outcome of history for decades, centuries into the future. And we are certainly at that, as Helga identified in her keynote presentation. She describes how Schiller used this term punctum saliens, which in drama and history describes the moment when everything starts moving inexorably. And she refers to those kind of moments as being what happened during World War I, or the events leading into World War II, and how that flowed into World War II. And of course says that in relation to the immediate future, however, manifold uncertainties cloud this insight when it becomes certain that a third and this time final global war, this time a nuclear war, will break out. It will be too late. Humanity, and with it our history, will be wiped out. Now, just to note on again, I think to note on that event, one of the speakers there, Dmitry Trenin, who is with the RAIC of Russia, other organizations that he's involved in, but he spoke at the event in Berlin, and today on Sputnik we have a article from him entitled "World War III Has Already Begun. In the West's eyes, Russia must be destroyed. That leaves us no choice." I won't detail any more than that, but I think just to come back to this point that Helga Zepp-LaRouche identified as the punctum saliens, obviously we know where we could go in terms of the dangers of war. But she outlined where humanity should go. And one of the things that came up in the first panel, which was entitled "Cooperation Between the BRICS and Europe to Implement the Oasis Plan and the Agenda 2063 for Africa," she announced a forthcoming Schiller Institute report, which is prepared in cooperation with the Chinese Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies, on how Europe, together with China and other BRICS countries, can support the development of Africa and Southwest Asia, in particular through joint ventures in this development. And she identifies the Oasis Plan as one of the key projects of that, which of course would be to tamp down not just simply tamp down tensions in Southwest Asia, but launch that region into a whole new development perspective and bring it into the Belt and Road Initiative, or the World Land Bridge, as Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have identified. Now, I think this idea of collaboration with China in third nations. That's something that China has proposed before. They even brought it up during the first Trump administration. So this is not a new idea. It would be certainly a way to deal with the unfolding financial problems, of the collapse of the transatlantic world and the indebtedness and so on, to actually deal with the tensions that way of collaboration in the development of third nations. But I think, that idea gets to the core of what underlies the global tensions right now. It is the absolute and fundamental collapse of the financial system of the City of London and Wall Street, which blew out in 2007, 2008. It has been papered over with the bailout system and various financial swindles since, but that is the driving factor. So, of course, what Helga laid out in Berlin is the approach that needs to be taken. Now, okay, so just coming to the what occurred yesterday between Trump and Rutte, I mean, you could just say that the schemes to keep the proxy war in Ukraine going for, according to Trump, at least for the next 50 days, to force Russia back to the table, which it's the negotiating table that they were at in Istanbul in 2022 when Boris Johnson came in and sabotaged it. But anyway, effectively, the scheme outlined by Rutte and Trump yesterday was Europe's going to use their non-existent money to buy non-existent weapons to send to a country, namely Ukraine, that is probably going to be soon non-existent. So this is not exactly anything that's working or will force Russia to the negotiating table. And in conventional terms, military conventional terms, the scheme means nothing. There's nothing that can be sent that could possibly help Ukraine. Dmitry Medvedev, who is, of course, former president, former prime minister, and the current deputy of Russia's Security Council, had a post, which is really the only official response so far, a post on X, where he dismissed this all as theatrical ultimatum. He said, Trump issued a theatrical ultimatum to the Kremlin. The world shuddered, expecting the consequences. Belligerent Europe was disappointed. Russia didn't care. So, yeah, as I mentioned, TASS characterized this as Moscow's first official reaction to Trump's statement. So I think this is not just Medvedev's own views. But again, this may have been, people I think are hopeful that this was, maybe Trump's way of kicking the can down the road, disentangling from what he called Joe Biden's war. Trump wishes that were the case, but nonetheless. But the danger is that in the superheated strategic environment, and maintaining that commitment to hegemony of the collapsing transatlantic system, we can get accidents, situations developing that are beyond the control of the actors who are participating in this tragedy. But I think just to make a point on this hegemony, it can never be realized. The nations of the BRICS, the development towards the multipolar world, or perhaps more accurately, what Putin called it, a polyphonic system. I think he said this last year, where that the various voices of the world can work towards harmony. I think that's what needs to occur. But those nations are committed to that development. Now, just to turn to the dangers that we presently face, unintended consequences, I want to come to the lead in today's Executive Intelligence Review, the Daily Alert. All of you should be subscribing to that to get a solid overview of the global situation. It begins, making an appeal that we can't be distracted by the day-to-day psychodrama, the endless news feeds and social media posts and so on. But it makes an appeal to be clear-eyed about the unfolding tragedy in order to avoid it. Dennis Speed, who wrote the lead, says that the tragicomedy in Ukraine with its Walmart Pagliacci, referring to, of course, Zelensky, who later in the lead, it reports on Alexander Mercouris of the Duran, who says that a source of his is discussing that there is moves to move out of Kiev by the Zelensky government, if you want to call it that, move operations toward Lvov in western Ukraine. There's been denials of that, and anyway, this is what Mercouris of the Duran reports on, but just an indication of where we are at. But what it says concerning the Trump's deadline, that is the lead in the Executive Daily Intelligence Alert, says, however, we should not only wish for the Ukraine war to end in 50 days, because that wish might be granted in ways that neither the United States nor Russia nor anyone else in the world except for haters of the human race would intend. And what it then goes into is an interview that Annie Jacobsen, who is the author of Nuclear War, A Scenario, she gave an interview on July 10th, which also included a guest, a former CIA intelligence officer named Andrew Bustamante, but they discussed the miscalculation and mistake concepts involved in when you have, in this case, nuclear armed nations squaring off against each other. And she refers to the case back in November, right before, after the election of Donald Trump, but while Biden was still in office, when the storm shadows by the United Kingdom were given to Ukraine, as well as the ATACMS. These were the long-range weapons that Russia was warning about. And so in that context, in this interview on July 10th, Annie Jacobsen refers to how Russia was angry about this. She said, and in response, they fired an intermediate range ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, okay? This is the first time in history that a ballistic missile was used in this kind of a kinetic war, a hot war. And she describes how she says, this was the kind of thing she warned about in Nuclear War, A Scenario, her book on the matter, where something's launched and the United States, because we have a launch on warning policy, launches before it lands because we're not willing to see what was on that warhead. That's what she says in the interview. Now, she goes on to say that what was in the warhead was nothing. And she was referring to the Oreshnik strike, which was not loaded, certainly not with nuclear weapons, but it looks to be a performative demonstration of Russia's capability, that is the Oreshnik. And she refers to how she was taken to the State Department to see where the notifications come in to identify what kind of weapons are being launched. And she says that in the context of Lavrov's warnings to the U.S. that he had said there was no nuclear warheads attached to this thing, but that the weapon was coming, that in the State Department there is this room that basically says, hello, she calls it the hello, we're not at war room, and goes on to detail that. But anyway, you get the point where she said that Lavrov had rang up this agency saying, we're launching and it doesn't have a nuclear warhead. So these are the kind of, how do we know, and as the tensions become more heated and as the commitment to hegemony and the commitment to keeping alive the failed system of the transatlantic, the financial system that has exploded already, these tensions become real. And I think this should be remembered that the Oreshnik is in the category of weapons that Putin outlined in his speech on March 1st, 2018. And this was the historic speech where he asked the world to listen to him. He said that, in the context, in that this was a speech that he gave to the Russian nation, and he talked about how those that have fueled the arms race, sought unilateral advantages over Russia, sanctions, everything that you wanted to impede with your policy has already happened. You have failed to contain Russia. That was from Putin's 2018 speech. But then he talked about how after the ABM treaty in 2002 was ended, he began these kind of measures of new weapon systems, what later was referred to as the weapons that would utilize new physical principles. But he ended that, or in that 2018 speech, he said, "No one listened to us then, so listen to us now." And certainly the Oreshnik was a reminder that it's time to listen. Now, Putin also just recently recounted, in fact, right before the meeting between Rutte and Trump, he gave an interview the day before, that I believe on Sunday, with Pavel Zarubin. And he talked about his speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, which he said he rewrote in the literally in the plane ride over to that speech in Munich, again in 2007. But he talked about how the idea of the global dominance of the global Britain, or the U.S., NATO expansion and all that, he said that in response to that, he said, Russia simply cannot live any other way. We will either be sovereign or we won't exist at all. So that was how Putin characterized it to Zarubin, and said that they lied. They promised no NATO expansion. They broke that promise. I hoped they would hear us. They didn't. So that's what Putin said on the eve of this meeting. And clearly the intent to keep the game alive, even though it won't work, is an indication of the kind of dangerous situation where even by accident, let alone by the insanity, that there are indeed some amongst the circles of the policymakers and so on that are insane enough to try to launch a first strike. But just the danger of accidents, as Annie Jacobson outlined, is the kind of world that we're in. So what do we do? Well, we have to do exactly what Helga Zepp-LaRouche outlined. This collaborative that the Schiller Institute will be putting out this report with the Chinese Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies on the idea of collaboration amongst the European nations. At least that's how it's presented in the report so far, in Africa. But that approach should be taken throughout the entire world. It is time for the United States, for the NATO structure, for global Britain to give up the imperial ghost. It's over. And now is the time for a new direction that Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have been fighting for over half a century. And that is what we need to do. So stay tuned to the LaRouche organization for more updates. Go to the schillerinstitute.com website, watch the proceeds of the conference, and stay tuned.